In JavaScript, you can call functions with any number of arguments that you like, and it will still work fine. For example, you can declare a function that is supposed to accept 2 arguments. So here in the declaration, we see that we have 2 parameters. Then we console log the first one, then we console log the second one. And here I can call it with 2 arguments. We console log the first one, then we console log the second one. Now what happens if you only give it 1 argument? The first parameter here will have the same value as this argument, but since we're not given a second argument, this parameter will have the value of undefined. If you call it with no arguments, you will have undefined for the first parameter and undefined for the second parameter. So now you can create a function that behaves differently. If you give it 2 arguments, it will do something. If you give it 1 argument, it will do another thing. And if you don't give it any argument, it will do something else. So here, to check for this, I can do an if statement. If the first parameter is undefined and the second one is undefined, I will return 0. Let's call it and see what it returns. Great, we have the correct result. If we use just 1 argument, this means that only b will be undefined. Else, if the second parameter is undefined, I will return just the first parameter. And let's call it with 5. And great, it returns 5. And now if we give it 2 parameters, we return the sum. So else return the first parameter plus the second one. Now let's call it with 2 arguments. And now we have the sum of these 2 numbers. So if we call it with no arguments, it will return 0. If we call it with 1 argument, it will return that argument. And if we call it with 2 arguments, it will return their sum. Great. In JavaScript, you can also give default values to parameters. So let's create a new function, greet here. This function will accept a language parameter. If it is en, it will console log hello. If it is fr, it will console log bonjour. And if it is es, it will console log hola. So let's call this function. Greet with en, and it will say hello. Let's call it with fr, it says bonjour. And let's call it with es, and it says hola. Great. Now, what if I call it with no parameters? Well, we have nothing. Nothing will happen. That's because this parameter has a value of undefined. Undefined does not return true in these conditions. Now you can give to this parameter a default value. If you don't provide to it any argument, it will be en. The English will be the default language. There are different ways you can give a default value to function parameters. Here we will see the simplest one. We check is the first parameter undefined. If this condition is true, this means we have no arguments in the function call. So we give to it the value of en by default. And now when we call the function with no parameters, the default language will be English. Great.